Senlin Ascends. A charming book. But what is it structured like? Does it follow a traditional 3-act structure? Or does it fail at that? Let's ponder these things. Hello, I'm Pete. This is the Ponderings of Pete. Welcome back. I'm a booktuber that, talks about sci-fi, fantasy, some non-fictional stuff. And yeah, that's kind of what I do. I like talking about things, and I'm trying to do more analytical things because writing reasons. So here we go. Let's talk about some interesting things about Senlin Ascends. I'm gonna jump back in and say this real quick. Please note this is a spoiler video, a very, very spoiler-filled video. So if you have not read Senlin Ascends, go read it because it's a really good book. So the question I want to talk about is kind of how Senlin is structured, because when I first read Senlin, which is, a month or two ago, I've only read it once, the structure of the story struck me as interesting because it seemed like it was different. And then recently, within a few days actually of reading it, I found on Discord an article, a Tumblr blog post about worldwide story structures. And that'll be linked down below by an author. Her name is Kim Yoon Mi. I honestly have not read anything she has written, but she seems very intellectual to the point, and she does her research, which is the great part. She was researching how the 3-act story structure is not really the only story structure, despite literary insistence in schools, in Hollywood, etc. The 3 to 5 act structure, I think, is the typical ones. That kind of got my mind rolling. And I started doing more research about story structures just to learn, because I didn't know that much about it. And I still don't, honestly. I just kind of did some Googling and I read a few things. So who am I to talk about them? This is the internet. Free speech, right? Right. So, what is a 3-act story structure? So 3-act story structure, I'm going to put a thing, graphic up here. So the 3-act story structure, there's obviously 3 parts. It's on on the x-axis, the up and down axis, the y-axis, you have the tension of the story. And then on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you're going to have the time of the story, the pace of the story. As the story goes on, the tension should rise at the very least. And in the first act, you have the inciting incident. We're going typical farm boy saves the world. That would be when his parents die or when his farm is destroyed. Looking at you, Aragon. That is the inciting incident. Well, Aragon, that's not all of the inciting incident, but things are destroyed by evil guys, and the chosen one goes on a quest to do something. Usually this is accompanied by a wiser older mentor, and yay, he's going to save the world. It is important to note that this can happen at the beginning, at the end, somewhere at any time during the first act, quote unquote. The second act, you're going to have a midpoint, a turning point for our hero, and typically at this turning point, this hero something is revealed to them, or they realize something about themselves, and it changes the nature of their journey. Whether it's going to be their nature of their journey being completely changed, or maybe the goal at the end of the journey changes. But something changes within the hero that causes character growth to a certain extent. Sometimes character growth, sometimes there's a new element introduced. They have to rescue somebody now, etc. And then we have the climax, the final act, where all the things in the story come together. You have the bad guy facing off against the chosen one, the good guy, and things happen. The good guy could die. The good guy could not die, depending on how subversive the tropes they are, or tropey/subversive they're being. But that's the end of the story. And then afterwards, you have something called I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, denouement, where it's kind of like the wrap-up. Historically speaking, the wrap-up of the story has gotten shorter and shorter in a lot of fictional books, in my opinion, over the last so many years, where there's less, hey, this is what happened afterwards. There's less closure, in my opinion. For instance, a good example of a really long denouement is Lord of the Rings. In Return of the King, the task with the ring is accomplished, and then you have chapters upon chapters afterwards. They talk about the hobbits going home. They talk about what the aftermath of the War of the Ring is, which is a pretty long one, versus in other books lately, it's kind of sometimes you'll get a fade to black after the thing is accomplished. Or maybe you'll have a, paragraph or two of 3 years later, haha, which is nice. But historically, I think they've been getting shorter. So that's 3-act story structure. Question is, does Senlin follow this exactly? Well, let's take a look at some of the things for it. And the first thing, of course, the most obvious thing is that Senlin is divided into 3 different parts. You have part 1, part 2, and part 3. So that's really easy. It's a 3-act structure, right? Well, that could denote a 3-act structure. But 3-act structures don't necessarily have to have, solid, this is Act 1, this is Act 2, this is Act 3. You could actually debate within some stories where Act 1, 2, and 3 start and end. They're really defined. Their really only definition is the high points, in my opinion, of the individual parts. The inciting incident, the midpoint, the actual climax. So that's really what we need to look at, because in part 1, is there an inciting incident? In part 2, is there a midpoint, a turning point for Senlin? And in part 3, is there a climax and then a denouement afterwards where something is accomplished and either the journey continues or the journey ends? So, looking at part 1. Obviously, it's going to be in part 1. Senlin loses his wife. That's really easy. He loses his wife, and thus his adventure begins, and he start off clueless, naive. Let's go forward. The second thing is there a midpoint, a turning point for Senlin? And yes, there is a turning point for Senlin. I'm glad you asked, though you didn't. Senlin has a turning point when he talks to the painter, when he realizes his wife was indeed in the very studio that he was at, and that he has an idea of where she might be. Where the painter says, hey, I know where she might be, I need you to do something. Before he does the heist, that's his turning point. Where he gets more methodical, he actually starts being smart. He actually starts doing, He starts doing things instead of just wandering around aimlessly. So he turns from being naive to actually okay, I'm going to take this tower for what it is, and I'm going to do with it what I will. I'm going to do whatever I can to get to my wife while not becoming like the tower. So that's when the painter tells him that the painter found his wife. That's his turning point. Is there a climax? Well, obviously. That's simple. The fight at the docks. There's a climax. That's where the tension reaches its highest point. And then afterwards, there's a very, very, very brief denouement once the ship is taken and his friends are all on the ship and they're sailing away. That's a very brief, full of hope. The journey continues. It's there. So, does Senlin Ascends follow a 3-act structure? With all of this evidence, I would be persuaded to say yes, it does. But it is not purely a 3-act structure.
No, there is another.
Why is that? There is another structure at work within this narrative. In fact, I will posit to you that there is another completely different protagonist. Senlin is our first protagonist. But our second protagonist, and thus our second story structure, who is based on it, is the Tower. So, the Tower, not a typical character, and insofar you could say it's more of just like a characterization from Senlin's perspective, I will refer to the Tower as a character. Because this is such an interesting concept in general. The first time I actually ever heard of this concept, this is not the first, but that is in Night Circus by Aaron Morgenstern. And when I read Night Circus, I loved it. I thought it was beautiful, the imagery and everything, it was awesome. But I read a bunch of reviews and I was like, oh, people don't like this. Why? And they're like, the characters were flawed, the author didn't deliver on expectations and some other stuff. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was reading a positive review and they were like, look, you go into this, the people that you think are the main characters aren't the main characters. The main character is the circus. And I was like, wow, that's such an interesting concept. Because it's true. The main character, that book jumps around between a lot of different characters over the entirety of the book. But the main character isn't any of them. It's the circus, and it's beautiful and amazing. And I really liked it because it's different. And it's a different perspective that was written really well. So, in this case, the Tower as a character. If the Tower has a structure, has a story structure, per se, an evolution of its character, what story structure does it follow? Well, one of the story structures, which is probably still familiar to you as the viewer, is the episodic story structure. Specifically one called the hook and pass story structure, episodic story structure. And so This particular structure relies on individual narratives, which may follow a 3-act, may follow whatever on the inside of them, but individual piecemeal narratives that all connect together an overarching narrative. And then this particular one does a hook and pass type of thing, where at the end of one narrative, you're going to see the beginnings, you're going to see the hook, you're going to get teased about the next narrative. And then it is passed on to the next individual narrative. So, where is this episodic structure contained? And how does it describe the tower? Well, that's quite elementary, my dear Watson. The floors. Each floor is an individual episode, quote unquote. You could even consider the outside, the market, its own episode. That it doesn't, so you have about 4 or 5 different episodes for us to understand the character of the tower and see the tower grow in the perspective of Senlin. So, where does it start? What does it do? We start off, Senlin doesn't know what the tower is. In fact, he has a completely incorrect assumption of the tower. The tower seems to be this glorious, amazing place of art, of culture, of morality, a bastion of civilization. And that is portrayed through Senlin's perception, through the guidebook, and it's just like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. But we soon see that is not the case. In episode 1, we have the market. Or actually, I will just say it's the market and floor 1. We have our incident of the other structure with Senlin's wife being taken. And from that, we see Senlin wandering around, and then you see him told that the tower eats people. Not literally, not chomp chomp, but it eats people. Specifically, that women float at the top. And that is the first instance of, and the wall of notes. That's like the first thing that Senlin really breaks Senlin's perception of the tower. So many people get lost. And so he is distraught. The next thing that kind of breaks is when he goes into the first floor, the basement. And he gets robbed. And he's just like, this is not what the guidebook told me would happen. In fact, the irony is the guidebook is one of the few things he has left. Because it's trash. Wasn't stolen, wasn't worth it. His stuff is taken. Sold off, presumably. And he sees, and eventually he comes to the merry-go-round. And this is kind of the first true active part of the tower that we see, in my opinion. The other things is people, the characteristics of the tower through the eyes of the people, which is the robbery, which is the notes on the wall. But we see the first active characteristic of the tower in the merry-go-rounds, where they serve, like at the outset, they serve no apparent purpose other than to get people drunk. I mean, you pedal around and then you drink and then you get thrown off, essentially. This goes back around. So it's kind of like, why are these here? The reader is confused because this is such a random Alice in Wonderland type moment when you're like, this is confusing. I don't know what to think of this. And nothing is told to you. You continue on and you are teased at the end of the episode with the parlor. Because before he gets to the parlor, he's told about the parlor. And at this hook, before it is passed, we see another picture of the tower. Another level, another ringdom of the tower painted as, this is so amazing. And at this point, Senlin is kind of skeptical, just a little bit, because of the experiences of the basement and the market. But he's still like, oh yeah, it'll be fine. I'm sure once I get to the higher levels, it's fine, it gets better, and he's still hopeful, albeit a smidge skeptical. The next thing. The next episode. Episode 2, Season 1, The Parlor. What does Senlin find? He finds a farce. He finds strange things. He finds the fireplaces, that the focus of the floor is not on the acting, as it was posited to him, as it was told to him. But in fact, the focus is of the entire floor is on the fireplaces, among other things. Another strange thing. Another oddity that the reader is confused by. It's possible at this point to determine what the fireplaces are for, but it is unlikely. There are certain facts that we do have about the baths that could possibly tell you about what the fireplaces are for, but no matter. It does not portray the true character of the tower yet. It is another inkling, another glimpse at, oh, the tower. And so we get the character the Parlor, which is such a fascinating character because everybody's an actor. Everybody's paying to escape. Everybody's paying to act, when in reality, you don't have to pay to act. You can just act your entire life out, because just leave and go somewhere else and be someone else. You can do that, theoretically. Usually takes a little bit of money, though. So this is just life. They're just paying to act like somebody else because they hate their lives, which is crazy because, like, that's kind of another opposite of what the tower was supposed to be. The tower is where good people came. The tower is where the moral and the just and the pillar of civilization. And yet people still want to escape. It's the pillar of the civilization. Why do people want to escape their lives? It is both the same as Senlin thought it was and completely different. And so he gets through it. He sees the horror of what people will do when they want to escape as much as they want to. Because everybody on that floor was an actor. Even the nurses cauterizing the people that were thrown out. It's crazy. Still wild every time I think about it. So he gets to the third one. The third floor. And this hook for the baths has been spread out through the entire story. Because this was the goal. This was the goal of Senlin, his wife. That he was trying to get to the baths the entire time. So this hook is a little bit more spread out over the entire story of, like, the baths. Relaxation. Vacation. Some fun stuff. It's like, yeah. Let's rest. This is the place of rest and relaxation. But is it that? Because with rest and relaxation come another thing. Apathy. And the baths, I think, epitomize that to a certain extent. At this, we see two things. We see two elements. Heat and water. And this is kind of the first place you can start to see what have been these floors' purpose. You see all this heat that is needed for the baths, the hot baths, and you can think, oh, well, there were fires down below, so obviously those were designed, the entire parlor floor is designed to heat the baths. But that is even only part of the truth, which is the fascinating part. And where does the water come from? I believe it is in this chapter that is first introduced the idea that the water came from below. The water came from wherever the well is, very, very down deep below the surface. And it's either in the first chapter or the first part or at this episode that Senlin is introduced to the Hods, the slaves, and he realizes on whose backs his tower was built and keeps running, the slaves. And he also realizes that the baths are not what he thought. And this is after his turning point. Apathy. Let's go back to apathy. The apathy is specifically illustrated by his friend, Taru. Taru wants to go home. Or does he? But he just keeps staying. He keeps spending money. So you see the apathy that is generated by the baths. And then conversely, you see the greed of the tower. How it eats people. Again. Through Taru, he keeps racking up more and more debts. But he can't pay them. So thus, he is eaten. He's turned into a hob. Hod. He's turned into a hod. Not a hob, a hod. Still sad. And so this man, he's turned into a hod, shaved, and just thrown into the tower to slave away. We still don't know who runs the tower at this point in time. And so, Senlin is disillusioned, which is fascinating to see him with each level become more and more disillusioned with this tower. He sees the apathy. He falls into the apathy for a time period before he meets the painter. And then he springs out of it. Because, hey, I can find my wife now. Or I have a goal to find. I have a concrete place of where my wife probably is. And he sees the corruption of the baths as well. With the commissioner. With all these paintings. And all this craziness. And he escapes. And the hook for this one is very slight. Because the hook is almost not... the hook is almost at the beginning of the next episode. But the painter kind of pushes him on. But the hook is kind of for episode 5, which is not going to come till an Arm of the Sphinx. So it's partially a hook for Arm of the Sphinx, partially a hook for the next episode, where the painter's like, go, I can get you out of here. Go find your wife. Or episode 4, which is New Babel. And this is where everything comes together. The structure of the tower, the character of the tower, at least as far as we know it, really comes together really well. New Babel is a power plant. And there's a city around it, but the city isn't as important this time because it's a den of villainy. It's Mos Eisley, sort of. Houses where you can sleep with people, words I can't say on YouTube, and all this other jazz, and you meet Viola, and you see the corruption there. But more importantly, you learn about why the other 3 floors existed. And this is where the character of the tower kind of comes into play, and you see how the character eats people through the Hods. You see how it uses people that it doesn't eat, and you understand why people don't leave to a certain extent. You see that the merry-go-rounds don't just pump beer, but they pump water, which goes up to the baths and other places throughout the tower as well, because the entire tower needs water. And then you come to, and you realize that the parlor was used to heat the baths. But the baths have another purpose, because the power in New Babel is generated using a steam power plant. So all the steam from the baths wafts up to the top and generates power for the entire tower, evidently. So you see that all the things that confused you have a purpose. And you see that the tower was there to utilize every single part of itself in order to sustain itself. And at this point, you see Senlin find, I think he said he found 14 different copies of the guidebook, none of them written by anyone who had really ever stepped foot inside the Tower of Babel, which is such an ironic thing that's so funny to me. And it makes sense, because if you write a guidebook for the tower, you're never going to leave if you actually go to the tower to try to experience it. So at this point in episode 4, kind of at the beginning of the last act, is when kind of the character of the tower solidifies. And you see it as a terrible thing instead of a beacon of morality and civilization. You see it as a pit. Ironically, because it's a tower and a pit is the opposite. You see it as a greedy thing that causes apathy and greed and all these other things, and it will utilize everything it can, whether it's the visitors or just taking the visitors up and making them Hods. And there's still more about the tower that you don't know. Like, okay, who rules the Hods? Who controls the Hods? Who's the Spider King? Etc. And you are teased that a little bit about different families, and then there's a mention of the Sphinx. But seeing Senlin's perception, and thus in Senlin's perception is the characterization of the tower, change is one of the things that I think is really, really cool about this book. And that's why everybody should read it. It reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, or more accurately, actually, Jules Verne books, which I've heard are some of his inspirations for this. Adventure type books like Jules Verne. I liked seeing different structures and starting to think about this a little bit more. So, what did you think? Did this make sense? That's actually the most important question. Did this make sense? And 2, did you see other things in the book? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know. Hopefully this month I'll get to Arm of the Sphinx. It's actually kind of looking less and less likely because I have a big chunker waiting for me. But I might. I still might. Yeah, like, subscribe, comment, hit that bell notification. Most importantly, get some rest, because you need it.